I do a fair amount of speaking around, but I must admit, this is a little intimidating. I've never spoken at the Cornell Nutrition Conference, and I've never spoken to so many people who I actually know and respect in the audience, including my former PhD advisor, my master's advisor. It's all a little bit intimidating, but I'm sure you'll stop me if I say something wrong. I'd like to thank AB Vista for inviting me to speak to you today on the impact of improved fiber utilization on performance. There's a number of methods that we have to improve overall dietary fiber digestibility for our cows. In the last especially 20 years or so, I'd say, we've done a lot to improve forage management on our farms, and we've gotten better forage genetics, such as with BMR corn silage, and that's helped us out a lot. And I think that's a lot of the reason for the improvements we've had in production, especially over the last decade. I think a lot of larger dairies have actually inadvertently improved the fiber digestibility in their rations when they don't have land base enough to produce enough forages, and they've had to add highly digestible non-forage fibers such as soy hulls or beet pulp. And this has actually given them a lot of advantages in terms of rumen health and intakes, that just because they didn't have enough forage to feed otherwise in the farm. And now we've got the opportunity to add supplemental fibrolytic enzymes on our dairies to further improve fiber digestibility, or to maybe replace some of these other techniques for improving fiber digestibility. We know when we have poor fiber digestibility, we're going to get less energy from the fiber. We're going to get reduced NDF intake. That's probably going to give us less milk. It's probably going to mean that we're going to have more energy in that diet from grain and fats. And so we're probably going to generate less money, obviously. By and large, we might also see some more subclinical acidosis with this situation, because we'll probably have to have a higher concentrate to forage ratio. With higher fiber digestibility, we're probably going to have, we will have more energy from the fiber. We're also going to get higher NDF intake. And that should yield more milk. Obviously, we have less energy that we need to supply from grain and fats, and that should give us more income over feed cost. We may or may not have more subclinical acidosis. If we're doing our job right and we're creating a healthier situation with less grain in the diet, we should have less subclinical acidosis. But I think many of you in the room have experienced situations, especially with BMR corn, where you actually don't get that less subclinical acidosis, and that's some of what we want to talk about today, is how we can make sure we always make an improvement in rumen health. I have a question mark there on feed efficiency. We may or may not see improvements in feed efficiency with higher fiber digestibility, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And again, we may or may not see improvements in fat. I think mainly if we're doing our job right, we will see improvements in milk fat. I think it's all about rumen function optimization. With higher NDF digestibility, we're going to get the higher fiber intake, we're going to get greater nutrient availability, but sometimes we have problems with passage rate. With that more digestible fiber, we often can get higher passage rate, and when things move through more quickly, gives us more problems in terms of rumen health and in terms of how much energy we're getting out of that feed. Obviously, we're also run the risk of having rumen pH problems. So if diets with higher fiber digestibility do not maintain or improve rumen function, our production response may be compromised. And I think there's mainly 5 factors. Maybe you guys could add some more to this list, but I want to highlight 5 factors which affect our performance response to higher NDF digestion. That was my assigned goal, was to talk about the performance response that we get to higher NDF digestion. But I want to preference it with discussion on these factors, because I think these determine whether or not we're going to get that response. First, rate and extent of NDF digestion, level of dietary undigested NDF, physically effective NDF, rumen available starch, and finally cow comfort and feeding management. And I think we need to put these all together when we predict the response. We know that if we get a higher rate and extent of NDF digestion, we're going to get more energy. And I think we do a pretty good job with our labs and our models to predict that improved energy that we're going to get from NDF when it's more digestible. We also know that high-producing cows with a well-functioning rumen are limited in forage intake by the bulkiness of the fiber which fills it up. And that bulkiness is going to be best estimated by the NDF content and by its NDF digestibility. Back in 1985, Dave Mertens suggested that a high-producing cow, should eat 1.2% of her body weight as NDF. And many of you have followed that rule for many years. Now we know with our very highly digestible pastures and maybe also some BMR, we can get 1.5, 1.8% of body weight NDF intake in our cows. I really like this study because I think it's fairly clean and shows the concept fairly well. This was a study done in Wisconsin. They replaced cornmeal with more soy hulls. So he either had a normal starch diet, which was actually about 27% starch, and a reduced starch diet where they bumped up the soy hulls and they took out they reduced the cornmeal in the diet. So both diets had 20.7% forage NDF. The reduced starch diet had about 6% more total NDF. And what they found was, lo and behold, NDF intake was quite a bit higher with a reduced starch diet. And if you put that in terms that I can relate to, and like what we just spoke about with the last slide, NDF intake with the normal starch diet was right at that 1.2 that Dr. Mertens calculated. And that with that reduced starch diet, with a very highly fermentable soy hulls, they were able to get 1.52% of body weight as NDF intake. And with that improvement in NDF intake, they found a much higher total dry matter intake. We know that NDF digestibility pretty much helps us, or I'm sorry, improving NDF digestibility helps us to basically give us gas to make more milk. But we also have to be careful about providing enough breaks to make sure we're not getting an acidosis situation. Your undigested NDF is really, to me, that woody lignified fiber. I put a nice picture of firewood up there. It's that woody lignified fiber which is going to help us put the brakes on the system and prevent the rumen acidosis. The 240-hour undigested NDF, to me, has three purposes in ration balancing. First, we can use it to better predict NDF digestibility and energy value. Second, we can use it to predict dry matter intake. Generally, the higher undigested NDF is, the more potentially we will limit dry matter intake. It can also be used to predict acidosis potential and rumen passage of feeds. If we don't have enough in there, we're going to have more potential for problems with rumen health. And Kurt Kotanch from the Minor Institute suggests we have a level of 0.3 to 0.4% of body weight. But he also stressed that this number can vary depending on farm and farm management and a lot of different things. And what I use it for mainly is to track each farms that I'm working with, basically saying that if you're at 0.35 now and cows are milking great, when you change forages, maybe you should continue to aim for 0.35. We also have to consider physically effective NDF as we think about how cows are going to respond to improvements in NDF digestibility. We know that physically effective NDF is very important for a number of things in that cow's rumen, not only for chewing and saliva production to neutralize acids and increase rumen pH, but also to form that rumen mat to slow passage of grains and increase digestibility, and also to facilitate movement of the rumen contents to the rumen wall to get absorption of acids. NDF digestibility and undigestible NDF are going to affect chewing time and rumen pH. Basically, your physically effective NDF is very important, but it doesn't tell the whole story in terms of how much that cow is going to have to chew her cud and how rumen pH is going to be affected. We know things like straw is going to take the cow. A cow's going to have to chew straw like twice as much as a more immature grass hay in order to get it digested. We know about those big differences, but we also need to remember that smaller differences are also important in terms of chewing and eating. This, again, is a study by Kurt Kotanch where he fed corn silage at 43% of the dry matter, either conventional or BMR. He found the dry matter intake was much higher with the BMR, as we'd expect. NDF intake as a percentage of body weight was also higher. And to me, very importantly, he found that the eating minutes per pound of NDF and the ruminating minutes per pound of NDF were lower with that BMR. And to me, that's very important in terms of how I put together that ration. If I know the cow's going to be chewing that BMR less, I may need to have a little bit more physically effective fiber in there. I may have to have a little bit more undigestible NDF in there to counteract the fact that she's going to be chewing that BMR less. This was a study done by Heather Dan where she had 3 treatments, a 50-50 forage to concentrate control diet, then a diet where she replaced some of that forage she increased the BMR in the diet to have 63% forage, or she maintained that 50-50 forage to concentrate ratio, but added non-forage fiber. So she increased the NDF from 35 up to 38. ADF was also increased. ADL was increased slightly. And physically effective NDF was also increased, while starch went from 26 down to 21. And what she found here, she was at a higher level of NDF, and I think that may have limited intake a little bit here for her higher fiber diets. So she had a higher intake for the 50% forage control. But what I want to note here is that the eating and ruminating was lower per pound of NDF with both the BMR and the non-forage fiber. So that tougher fiber here, in terms of eating per pound of NDF, they spent more time eating per pound of NDF here than with the more digestible fiber sources. Total chewing time was not different amongst the 3 treatments here. And I think we also, because we had higher starch in this diet, we ended up having a bit higher, or a bit more time under the curve in terms of pH, more time at pH less than 5.5 with that 50-50 diet. This is a study that Dr. Rick Grant did a great job explaining yesterday, and I hope you were all there because I'm not the best at explaining this study. But I like this study because it really shows the interaction between the undigestible NDF and physically effective fiber. And my point in showing this is not that I understand everything that happened here, but to remember that there's an interaction between the two. And we can't forget that interaction while we're balancing diets. What they did is they had either low UNDF diets or high UNDF diets. So if the forage was obviously lower in the low UNDF diets at 47%, and up to 60% forage in the diet with those high UNDF diets. And then what they did was they varied the physically effective NDF in those diets by either adding short-cut Timothy hay or long-cut Timothy hay. And what they found here was that the eating time was lower with those low UNDF, low physically effective NDF diets, but obviously much higher as you went to the high diet. Come down here and you look at the eating per minute of NDF, much lower. Or I should say it was actually lowest with the low diet and not that much different with those intermediate diets, but much higher with the high UNDF, high physically effective NDF diet. Basically, those cows, as he mentioned yesterday, really had to chew to get the particle size down there, and that's what affected the eating time. But what I found was most interesting, and I thought he thought it was very interesting as well, was that these two diets in the middle, where they basically fed a short, physically effective fiber diet with high undigestible NDF, they found there really wasn't much difference between that diet and this diet with low UNDF and high physically effective NDF. So basically the conclusion was that if you've got some poorer quality forage with more UNDF and you can break it down more, have a finer particle size, it could help you to maintain both dry matter intake and energy-corrected milk. The energy-corrected milk was similar across these 3 diets, and it really only dropped down when you had the high UNDF diet with high physically effective NDF. So let's talk about cow comfort and feeding management. Again, I think this needs to be put into the equation as we think about whether or not cows will respond to an improvement in NDF digestibility. I put a nice picture of a cow's nose there to remind me that what we're thinking about is not only how much that cow is going to eat and chew her cud and ruminate, but also when she's going to do that. And I know that can be a bit of a vague term, but those of you who are out there in the field every day know that, you know, cows can slug feed, cows can sort their rations, cows can do a lot of bad things that can screw up our rations. And this is what I'm thinking about when I put up this slide. I like this again, it sounds like I work at the Minor Institute. I don't. I only live 10 miles away, but I don't work there. But I like the information they put out, the research that they do. This is a table that I put together from something Rick Grant had, showing the rumination reduction. And you know all this. I'm just reminding you of it, that first calf heifers and mixed parity groups are going to ruminate 16% less. If cows are overcrowded, in terms of stalls and manger space, they may ruminate 10 to 20% less. Too much headlock time, 14% less. Uncomfortable resting surfaces, 15% less. And heat stress, 22% less. And I know you all know this, and I bet you could, you know, add 10 more things here to this list that are going to affect how a cow ruminates, and also, again, how and when she eats her different feedstuffs during the day. I also like, and nobody Rick doesn't even emphasize this, but I really like this comment of his about first calf heifers that lie down in a stall and they know it's preferred by an older cow. They're going to ruminate 40% less. And what I'd really like is like a little video kind of showing that cow, probably backwards in the stall. You know how heifers will do that in a free stall sometimes. They'll go backwards in that stall, and you can just see her laying down and looking back and forth and saying, oh, crud, Big Mama's going to come, and she's going to beat me up and get me out of this stall. And so she's focused more on that than she is ruminating. And maybe Rick won't have that same comment, but that's kind of what goes through my mind. So when we're in that situation, when we've got cows that aren't ruminating as much as they're supposed to, and in that situation where I know you all have these farms that, well, you know, things just don't go right every day, every hour of the day. They're not the best feeding managers. I used to have a few of those. You've got to put in more safety into that system when you balance that diet. You're going to have to formulate that ration with more physically effective NDF and more undigestible NDF in order to keep the brakes on the system, to keep that cow out of acidosis and have rumen health that's adequate and keep that cow performing as well as she can. Finally, we talk about rumen available starch. A balancing act goes on each minute of the day inside that cow. And I think about this when I'm on the farm. I'm thinking about that fiber, which we're primarily, well, fiber which we're using for energy, but also very importantly, which is needed to create saliva to buffer that cow's system, and the grain, which is producing acid. And I think about how that's happening on a minute-by-minute basis throughout the day. We know that the rumen pH of cows will vary, again, throughout the entire day. We know that total starch is very important, but we also have to remember that the degradability of that starch is also very important. In this slide, we can see that corn, this is a situation where we had both corn or barley in the TMR, and we had more hours of the day where with the corn diet, pH was higher than with the barley diet. Just saying that the speed of the fermentation of the barley was higher than with the corn, and so we're going to have more challenges with rumen pH with that barley diet. In our situation in the Northeast, we don't work with much barley, but we might have some very moist, high-moisture corn, which is very finely ground, and it's like rocket fuel. And you and I both know that there's more risk with acidosis, more time where the rumen pH will be less than 5.8 or less than 6 in that situation, and we need to counteract that with changing our fiber content of the diet. So what's our optimum rumen available starch? It's going to be dependent on a lot of things. It's going to be dependent on milk production, days in milk, management, feeding behavior, all those fiber fractions as well as sugar, and it's going to be dependent on the starch digestion rate. As we have higher fiber digestibility, more energy is going to be coming from the fiber, less energy is going to be needed from the starch, and that's a good thing. If we are reducing the amount of indigestible NDF when we have higher fiber digestibility, maybe we'd be better off by slightly lowering dietary starch to improve rumen health. Or maybe when we've got that rapidly digestible fiber coming into the diet, maybe we don't want to complement that with that wet, high-moisture corn, or we might get into trouble. So this is basically back to the title of my talk, which was the impact of improved fiber utilization on performance. But I want you to think about those 5 factors as we try to predict what's going to happen when we have improved fiber digestion. I want to first talk about physical feed efficiency, which is the kilos or pounds of 3.5 fat-corrected milk per kilo or pound of dry matter intake. You guys are familiar with this. We've got some specific goals, and basically our goal is to make milk out of the feed instead of making manure. And there's very good legitimate reasons for calculating this number and talking about this number. We know when we get too high rate of passage or we've got rumen health issues, we'll have more nutrients going out of the rumen and going into the manure, and we don't want that to happen. I think we can use this calculation, in the research world. If we add yeast and we're not changing the diet at all, we can use physical feed efficiency as a measure to reasonably give us an indication of whether we made improvements. But we really need to remember that physical feed efficiency does not tell us the whole story of what's going on in a number of situations, both on our farms and as we compare rations that we use for research. It doesn't tell us anything about animal body gains and losses. And to me, very importantly, it doesn't tell us anything about the cost per pound of that dry matter consumed. If you change your nutrient profile, if you're going to add more of an expensive rumen undegradable protein to the diet, that's obviously going to change the cost of every pound that cow eats. If you change the nutrient density by adding fat or changing the forage to concentrate ratio, that's very important. So basically, I have my little simple example here. Who is more efficient? You've got a cow who's making 90 pounds of milk, fat-corrected milk, and she's eating 51 pounds of dry matter intake. So she's got a 1.76 feed efficiency. You've got another cow, again, making 90 pounds, but she's eating 55 pounds of dry matter intake. So she's got a 1.64. And some people would look at that blindly and say, oh, she's the most efficient cow. Well, this cow here, she's eating a pound of bypass fat, and she's eating a pound of animal protein. Again, my example is very simple, I know. That diet obviously is going to cost more per cow per day, and her income over feed cost is going to be lower than this cow over here, who is going to eat more fiber and less starch, less expensive bypass fat, less animal protein. To me, this is the situation which we're thinking about more when we're improving NDF digestibility. If I'm going to improve NDF digestibility, I'm going to drop the corn back, I'm going to drop the fat back, I'm going to hope those cows eat more, they should eat more. And to me, this is the cow that's more efficient, not this cow here. And I think you guys all would agree with me on this, but I guess it just frustrates me that we keep on talking about feed efficiency. And I really hate it when they say, the beef people have been doing it for 50 years, so of course we should do it. Well, the beef people rarely, at least in the feedlots, they don't change their forage to concentrate ratio, so of course they can look at feed efficiency. But when we're changing things like forage to concentrate ratio and fat and animal protein, that makes a big difference to me as to who is more profitable. To me, this cow is much more profitable than this cow. So cows, again, I want to go back to some of the studies I already showed to talk about more specifically the milk production and the milk fat from these studies. This is back to the Wisconsin study where they increased the soy hulls and took out cornmeal when they did that. And they had a 27% starch diet versus a 22% starch diet. When they did that, lo and behold, they got more milk fat and they got more fat-corrected milk, which to me is a great thing. I think they improved rumen health when they did that, got more energy, and successfully improved milk production. In this situation, they did not improve feed efficiency. But I think most of you in the room would agree with me that this was the healthier diet, and this would probably be more likely the diet that a lot of farmers would like better, with improved milk fat and production. This was, again, back to the study that Heather Dan did. And in her situation, with the BMR corn, she had a little bit lower intake. Milk yield was a little bit lower. But fat was improved up to 3.98 from 3.66 with the BMR forage. And fat-corrected milk, your feed efficiency here at the bottom wasn't changed at all. With the non-forage fiber, kind of similar results there. Fat didn't go up quite as much, but milk production was a little bit higher. And this was a study by Kotanch, which was done back in 2010. This is the study I showed you before where they had 43% of either BMR or conventional corn silage. And what they found was that milk production actually wasn't improved that much with this study. Actually, not at all. It's non-significant. Fat, also just a touch higher, but that wasn't significant. But he got a lower feed efficiency, 1.6 versus 1.5. In this situation, since they really didn't change anything other than swapping conventional corn for BMR, I'll look at those feed efficiency numbers a little bit more. But it makes sense here because we got less eating minutes per kilo of NDF, less ruminating minutes per kilo of NDF, and they didn't change the diet at all when they just swapped in BMR versus instead of conventional corn. So with no other ration adjustments like adding some extra NDF or adding some extra straw, there was less chewing and possibly a higher rate of passage. And I think that's what generated our lower feed efficiency and really not any response in terms of milk. And those of you who have been in the feed industry for many years who've had to wrestle with BMR, especially when BMR first came out, you probably had one or two of these situations where you thought everything was going to go right, you thought everything was going to go great, and it didn't go great because probably when you improved fiber digestibility, you lost some rumen mat, you lost some chewing, and that compromised rumen health, and you didn't get the response that you wanted. So let's talk briefly about responses to fibrolytic enzyme supplementation. And if you look in the literature, you'll find there's quite a lot of good responses to enzymes, but you'll also find that it varies a bit. This was a study done back in 1999 where they fed either none, low, medium, or high amounts of enzyme. And they did find actually a fairly dramatic improvement from 90 to over 100 pounds of milk with the medium rate of enzyme addition. Although for some reason when they got to the high rate of enzyme addition, they were kind of back down 10 pounds on milk production and back down in terms of fat. Was that a situation? I don't know. I'm not an enzyme expert, but did they add so much that they got themselves into trouble? I'm not really sure. But they did see a very nice response to that medium level. And here's another study where when they added the extra enzyme, they did get the response in milk production from 79 to 87, but they got a fairly significant drop in milk fat production. So again, did they not have quite enough undigestible fiber or physically effective fiber in there? And it got them into trouble when they added the enzyme. Similar here to this study back in 1999. They really didn't get that much milk, but milk fat was lowered quite a bit. This was a recent study done where they added xylanase and cellulase at 3 different levels. And most importantly to me here is it was barley silage diet, fairly high in barley silage, fairly high in barley grain. They actually did have a fairly high level of indigestible NDF in this study as well, though. In this situation, what they found, again, was that medium level of enzyme where they got the best responses, here at 0.75. That's where they got a nice response in terms of milk and milk fat. Dry matter intake was not affected, though. But look here in terms of milk fat percent, 3.12, 3.05, went up to 3.28, and then down to 2.85. And I know you Canadians in the group, you think in America we're all this low, but truly, I know my Quebecers in the back, we're not this low normally in the U.S. And this is a cause for concern to me that these diets generated such low milk fats. And again, my concern is, what was the rumen pH? I didn't see it published in the paper, but were we in the midst of, we got a little bit bad situation in terms of rumen health when we added the fibrolytic enzyme to the diet? So if I'm AB Vista with an enzyme, if I'm a company trying to sell brown midrib corn, if I'm a farmer deciding whether or not to purchase these products, I really want to be able to predict the responses to improve fiber utilization. And I show this slide a lot. I'm sure you're familiar with this analysis by Oba and Allen back in 1999. they decided that 1 unit increase in NDF digestibility was going to give 0.37 pounds of dry matter intake and 0.55 pounds of fat-corrected milk. And this is very nice, and I'm hopeful that this is this is accurate. I'm sure it's accurate for what they had. But my concern is that this doesn't take into account any of the things we just talked about. It doesn't take into account physically effective NDF. It doesn't take into account undigestible NDF, starch, or anything like that. It doesn't take into account cow comfort and how well those cows were eating and how much they were eating every day. There was a recent meta-analysis done looking at the effect of adding fibrolytic enzyme to the diet. And in this situation, they didn't look at what I was interested in at all. They looked at important things, but not all the important things. They looked at enzyme type, enzyme form, enzyme application rate, enzyme application method, and duration of experiment. This is what they added into their meta-analysis when they were trying to predict the response to fibrolytic enzyme. And they did get, some improvements. They found improvement in digestibility and NDF. They did not find that there was a significant improvement in dry matter intake. They did not find a significant improvement in feed efficiency. They did find small improvements in milk yield and in 3.5% fat-corrected milk yield. The analysis, this was all of the enzymes that they looked at. When they specifically looked at cellulase, xylanase enzymes, they found that they actually improved the milk response just a little bit more. And the author suggested that these small to moderate increases could be due to variability in the enzyme, as well as rate and method of application. And I don't deny that. Probably that is a big factor in whether or not that enzyme worked. But as a nutritionist, not as a person who works with, all those things associated with enzyme application, I think we also need to remember that we have to think about other things in the diet that are going on and what's going on in the rumen when we apply these enzymes. So I hope I've convinced you that many factors need to be considered all at the same time when we predict responses to improved NDF digestion. UNDF, physically NDF, cow comfort, how good our rumen mat is, total NDF digestibility, rumen pH, starch digestion, feeding management, milk yield, days in milk, rumination. Are we even energy limiting in the diet, or is lysine the limiting factor in the diet? All those things are going to affect the response that we get to adding enzyme or to improving fiber digestion. And I guess my suggestion to you today is that as if you're a researcher and you're researching improvements in NDF digestibility, please look at these things. Please report these things. Please really analyze the diet well, because we need to have those factors if hopefully we go on and do a meta-analysis that really looks at those things and takes those things into account when we're trying to predict the effect of NDF digestibility. And if you're a feed person and you're going to a farm tomorrow, and you're hopefully, you're going to get into BMR or you're going to feed an enzyme tomorrow, hopefully think about these things, track these things, and monitor these things. And please also don't just put everything in your computer and say everything will be great. Go out and look at the cows, look at the manure, look at the cud chewing, and make a good decision on that. Because unfortunately, we do not have the models which tell us everything. I know some of you think that is great, but it's not going to happen. You need to be looking at the cows, and you need to be making the changes based on what you see. And hopefully, in the future, and hopefully not too distant future, we can have models or meta-analysis that give us the information that we need, that pull these factors together so that we can really predict the performance of cows as we improve NDF digestibility. Finally, our bottom line, I think, and we know, that if you characterize and balance diets according to NDF and starch digestibility to optimize rumen function, then to me, there's no doubt, high fiber digestion will improve fiber intake, milk and milk components, and definitely increase profitability. Thank you very much.